Chapter 24 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 24, Military Emancipation. Not only President Lincoln, but the country at large as well, was surprised to find in the newspapers of August 30 a proclamation from the commander of the Department of the West of startling significance. The explanations of its necessity and purpose were altogether contradictory, and its mandatory orders were so vaguely framed as to admit of dangerous variance in interpretation and enforcement. Reciting the disturbed condition of society and defining the boundaries of army occupation, it contained the following important decrees. Circumstances, in my judgment, of sufficient urgency render it necessary that the commanding general of this department should assume the administrative powers of the state. In order, therefore, to suppress disorder, to maintain as far as now practicable the public peace, and to give security and protection to the persons and property of loyal citizens, I do hereby extend and declare established martial law throughout the state of Missouri. All persons who shall be taken with arms in their hands within these lines shall be tried by court-martial, and if found guilty will be shot. The property, real and personal, of all persons in the state of Missouri who shall take up arms against the United States, or who shall be directly proven to have taken an active part with their enemies in the field, is declared to be confiscated to the public use, and their slaves, if any they have, are hereby declared free men. The object of this declaration is to place in the hands of the military authorities the power to give instantaneous effect to existing laws and to supply such deficiencies as the conditions of war demand. But this is not intended to suspend the ordinary tribunals of the country, where the law will be administered by the civil officers in the usual manner and with their customary authority, while the same can be peaceably exercised. Despite its verbiage and confusion of subjects, it was apparent that this extraordinary document was not a measure of military protection, but a political maneuver. Since the first movement of the armies, the slavery question had become a subject of new and vital contention, and the anti-slavery drift of public opinion throughout the North was unmistakably manifest. There was no room for doubt that General Fremont, apprehensive about his loss of prestige through the disaster to Lyon and the public clamors growing out of his mistakes in administration, had made this appeal to the latent feeling in the public mind as a means of regaining his waning popularity. Full confirmation was afforded by his immediately convening under his proclamation a military commission to hear evidence and beginning to issue personal deeds of manumission to slaves. The proceeding strongly illustrates his want of practical sense. The delay and uncertainty of enforcement under this clumsy method would have rendered the theoretical boon of freedom held out to slaves rare and precarious, if not absolutely impracticable. As soon as an authentic text of the proclamation reached President Lincoln, he wrote and dispatched the following letter by special messenger to the general at St. Louis. Washington, D.C., September 2, 1861. Major General Fremont. My dear sir, 2 points in your proclamation of August 30 give me some anxiety. First, should you shoot a man according to the proclamation, the Confederates would very certainly shoot our best men in their hands in retaliation, and so man for man indefinitely. It is therefore my order that you allow no man to be shot under the proclamation without first having my approbation or consent. Second, I think there is great danger that the closing paragraph in relation to the confiscation of property and the liberating slaves of traitorous owners will alarm our Southern Union friends and turn them against us, perhaps ruin our rather fair prospect for Kentucky. Allow me, therefore, to ask that you will, as of your own motion, modify that paragraph so as to conform to the first and fourth sections of the Act of Congress entitled An Act to Confiscate Property Used for Insurrectionary Purposes, approved August 6, 1861, and a copy of which act I herewith send you. This letter is written in a spirit of caution and not of censure. I send it by special messenger in order that it may certainly and speedily reach you. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. It was the reply to the above which the General sent to Washington by the hand of Mrs. Fremont, and which contained a very lame apology for the dictatorial and precipitate step he had taken. He wrote, "Trusting to have your confidence, I have been leaving it to events themselves to show you whether or not I was shaping affairs here according to your ideas. The shortest communication between Washington and St. Louis generally involves 2 days, and the employment of 2 days in time of war goes largely towards success or disaster. I therefore went along according to my own judgment, leaving the result of my movements to justify me with you. And so in regard to my proclamation of the 30th, between the rebel armies, the provisional government, and home traitors, I felt the position bad and saw danger. In the night I decided upon the proclamation and the form of it. I wrote it the next morning and printed it the same day. I did it without consultation or advice with anyone, acting solely with my best judgment to serve the country and yourself, and perfectly willing to receive the amount of censure which should be thought due if I had made a false movement. This is as much a movement in the war as a battle, and in going into these I shall have to act according to my judgment of the ground before me, as I did on this occasion. If upon reflection your better judgment still decides that I am wrong in the article respecting the liberation of slaves, I have to ask that you will openly direct me to make the correction. The implied censure will be received as a soldier always should the reprimand of his chief. If I were to retract of my own accord, it would imply that I myself thought it wrong, and that I had acted without the reflection which the gravity of the point demanded. But I did not. I acted with full deliberation, and upon the certain conviction that it was a measure right and necessary, and I think so still. In regard to the other point of the proclamation to which you refer, I desire to say that I do not think the enemy can either misconstrue or urge anything against it, or undertake to make unusual retaliation. The shooting of men who shall rise in arms against an army in the military occupation of a country is merely a necessary measure of defense, and entirely according to the usages of civilized warfare. The article does not at all refer to prisoners of war, and certainly our enemies have no ground for requiring that we should waive in their benefit any of the ordinary advantages which the usages of war allow to us. Fremont thus chose deliberately to assume a position of political hostility to the President. Nevertheless, Mr. Lincoln, acting still in his unfailing spirit of dispassionate fairness and courtesy, answered as follows: Sir, yours of the 8th, in answer to mine of the 2nd instant, is just received. Assuming that you, upon the ground, could better judge of the necessities of your position than I could at this distance, on seeing your proclamation of August 30, I perceived no general objection to it. The particular clause, however, in relation to the confiscation of property and the liberation of slaves appeared to me to be objectionable in its nonconformity to the act of Congress passed the 6th of last August upon the same subjects, and hence I wrote you expressing my wish that that clause should be modified accordingly. Your answer just received expresses the preference on your part that I should make an open order for the modification, which I very cheerfully do. It is therefore ordered that the said clause of said proclamation be so modified, held, and construed as to conform to and not to transcend the provisions on the same subject contained in the Act of Congress entitled "An Act to Confiscate Property Used for Insurrectionary Purposes," approved August 6, 1861, and that said act be published at length with this order. As might have been expected, Fremont's proclamation of military emancipation and Lincoln's order revoking it produced an acrimonious discussion of the slavery question. The incident made the name of Fremont a rallying cry for men holding extreme anti-slavery opinions, and to a certain extent raised him to the position of a new party leader. The vital relation of slavery to the rebellion was making itself felt to a degree which the great body of the people, so long trained to a legal tolerance of the evil, could not yet bring themselves to acknowledge. Men hitherto conservative and prudent were swept along by the relentless logic of the nation's calamity to a point where they were ready at once to accept and defend measures of even the last necessity for the nation's preservation. With admirable prudence, Lincoln himself added nothing to the public discussion, but a confidential letter written to a conservative friend who approved and defended Fremont's action will be found of enduring interest. Private and confidential. Executive Mansion, Washington, September 22, 1861. Honorable O. H. Browning. My dear Sir, yours of the 17th is just received, and coming from you, I confess it astonishes me that you should object to my adhering to a law which you had assisted in making and presenting to me less than a month before is odd enough. But this is a very small part. General Fremont's proclamation as to confiscation of property and the liberation of slaves is purely political, and is not within the range of military law or necessity. If a commanding general finds a necessity to seize the farm of a private owner for a pasture, an encampment, or a fortification, he has the right to do so, and to so hold it as long as the necessity lasts. And this is within military law, because within military necessity. But to say the farm shall no longer belong to the owner, or his heirs forever, and this as well when the farm is not needed for military purposes as when it is purely political, without the savor of military law about it. And the same is true of slaves. If the general needs them, he can seize them and use them. But when the need is past, it is not for him to fix their permanent future condition. That must be settled according to laws made by lawmakers, and not by military proclamations. The proclamation in the point in question is simply dictatorship. It assumes that the general may do anything he pleases, confiscate the lands and free the slaves of loyal people as well as of disloyal ones, and going the whole figure, I have no doubt, would be more popular with some thoughtless people than that which has been done, but I cannot assume this reckless position, nor allow others to assume it on my responsibility. You speak of it as being the only means of saving the government. On the contrary, it is itself the surrender of the government. Can it be pretended that it is any longer the government of the United States, any government of constitution and laws, wherein a general or a president may make permanent rules of property by proclamation? I do not say Congress might not, with propriety, pass a law on the point, just such as General Fremont proclaimed. I do not say I might not, as a member of Congress, vote for it. What I object to is that I, as President, shall expressly or impliedly seize and exercise the permanent legislative functions of the government. So much as to principle. Now as to policy. No doubt the thing was popular in some quarters, and would have been more so if it had been a general declaration of emancipation. The Kentucky legislature would not budge till that proclamation was modified. And General Anderson telegraphed me that on the news of General Fremont having actually issued deeds of manumission, a whole company of our volunteers threw down their arms and disbanded. I was so assured as to think it probable that the very arms we had furnished Kentucky would be turned against us. I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. These all against us, and the job on our hands is too large for us. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of this capital. On the contrary, if you will give up your restlessness for new positions and back me manfully on the grounds upon which you and other kind friends gave me the election and have approved in my public documents, we shall go through triumphantly. You must not understand I took my course on the proclamation because of Kentucky. I took the same ground in a private letter to General Fremont before I heard from Kentucky. You think I am inconsistent because I did not also forbid General Fremont to shoot men under the proclamation? I understand that part to be within military law. But I also think, and so privately wrote General Fremont, that it is impolitic in this, that our adversaries have the power, and will certainly exercise it, to shoot as many of our men as we shoot of theirs. I did not say this in the public letter because it is a subject I prefer not to discuss in the hearing of our enemies. There has been no thought of removing General Fremont on any ground connected with his proclamation, and if there has been any wish for his removal on any ground, our mutual friend, Sam Glover, can probably tell you what it was. I hope no real necessity for it exists on any ground. Your friend as ever, A. Lincoln. The reader will not fail to note that the argument of this letter seems diametrically opposed to the action of the President when exactly 1 year later he issued his preliminary proclamation of emancipation, as well as to that of the final one on the first day of January 1863. Did Mr. Lincoln change his mind in the interim? The answer is twofold. He did not change his mind as to the principle. He did change his mind as to the policy of the case. Rightly to interpret Mr. Lincoln's language, we must imagine ourselves in his position and examine the question as it presented itself to his mind. Congress, by the act of August 6, 1861, had authorized him to cause property used or employed in aid of insurrection to be seized, confiscated, and condemned, providing, however, that such condemnation should be by judicial proceeding. He saw that Fremont, by mere proclamation, assumed to confiscate all property, both real and personal, of rebels in arms, whether such property had been put to insurrectionary use or not, and going a step further, had annexed a rule of property by decreeing that their slaves should become free. This assumption of authority Lincoln rightly defined as simply dictatorship and as being, if permitted, the end of constitutional government. The case is still stronger when we remember that Fremont's proclamation began by broadly assuming the administrative powers of the state, that its declared object was mere individual punishment, and the measure a local police regulation to suppress disorder and maintain the peace. Also that it was to operate throughout Missouri, as well within as without the portions of the state under his immediate military control. Military necessity, therefore, could not be urged in justification. The act was purely administrative and political. The difference between these extra military decrees of Fremont's proclamation and Lincoln's acts of emancipation is broad and essential. Fremont's act was one of civil administration, Lincoln's a step in an active military campaign. Fremont's was local and individual, Lincoln's national and general. Fremont's partly within military lines, Lincoln's altogether beyond military lines. Fremont's an act of punishment, Lincoln's a means of war. Fremont's acting upon property, Lincoln's acting upon persons. National law, civil and military, knew nothing of slavery and did not protect it as an institution. It only tolerated state laws to that effect and only dealt with fugitive slaves as persons held to service. Lincoln did not, as dictator, decree the abrogation of these state laws. But in order to call persons from the military aid of the rebellion to the military aid of the Union, he, as commander-in-chief, armed by military necessity, proclaimed that persons held as slaves within rebel lines should on a certain day become free unless rebellion ceased. Thus no real distinction of principle exists between his criticism of Fremont's proclamation and the issuing of his own. On the other hand, there is a marked and acknowledged change of policy between the date of the Browning letter and the date of his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In September 1861, he stood upon the position laid down in the Chicago platform. Upon that, expressed in the constitutional amendment and endorsed in his inaugural, upon that declared by Congress in July in the Crittenden resolution, namely, that the general government would not interfere directly or indirectly with the institution of slavery in the several states. This policy Lincoln undertook in good faith to carry out, and he adhered to it so long as it was consistent with the safety of the government. His Browning letter is but a reaffirmation of that purpose. At the time he wrote it, military necessity was clearly against military emancipation, either local or general. The revocation of Fremont's decree saved Kentucky to the Union and placed 40,000 Kentucky soldiers in the Federal Army. But 1 year after the date of the Browning letter, the situation was entirely reversed. The Richmond campaign had utterly failed. Washington was menaced. The country was despondent, and military necessity now justified the policy of general military emancipation. Whatever temporary popularity Fremont gained with anti-slavery people by his proclamation was quickly neutralized by the occurrence of a new military disaster at Lexington. The Battle of Wilson's Creek and the retreat of the Union Army to Rolla left the Confederate forces master of southwest Missouri. The junction of rebel leaders, however, which had served to gain that advantage, was of short duration. Their loosely organized and badly supplied army was not only too much crippled to follow the Union retreat, but in no condition to remain together. Price, as Major General of Missouri State forces, had only temporarily waived his rank and consented to serve under McCulloch, holding but a brigadier general's commission from Jefferson Davis. The disagreement of the leaders and the necessities of the troops almost immediately compelled the separation of the rebel army. General Pierce, with his Arkansas State forces, returned home, and General McCulloch, with his 3 Confederate regiments, also marched back into Arkansas, taking up again his primary task of watching the Indian Territory. General Price held his numerous but heterogeneous Missouri followers together, and busying himself for a time in gathering supplies, started back in a leisurely march northward from Springfield towards the Missouri River. The strong secession feeling of southwestern Missouri rapidly increased his force, liberally furnished him supplies, and kept him fully informed of the numbers and location of the various Union detachments. There were none in his line of march till he neared the town of Lexington on the Missouri River. Ex-Governor Jackson had recently convened the rebel members of his legislature here, but a small detachment of Union troops sent from Jefferson City occupied the place, dispersing them and capturing their records and the Great Seal of the state, brought by the governor in his flight from the capital. About the 1st of September, the Union commander at Jefferson City heard of the advance of Price and sent forward the Chicago Irish Brigade under Colonel James A. Mulligan to reinforce Lexington with directions to fortify and hold it. Mulligan reached Lexington by forced marches, where he was soon joined by the Union detachment from Warrensburg retreating before Price. The united Federal force now numbered 2,800 men with 8 guns. Price pushed forward his cavalry and made a slight attack on the 12th, but was easily repulsed and retired to await the arrival of his main body, swelled by continual accessions to some 20,000 men with 13 guns, and on the 18th he again approached and formally laid siege to Lexington. Mulligan made good use of this interim, gathering provisions and forage, casting shot, making ammunition for his guns, and enclosing the college building and the hill on which it stood, an area of some 15 acres with a strong line of breastworks. Price began his attack on the 18th, but for 2 days made little headway. Slowly, however, he gained favorable positions. His sharpshooters, skilled riflemen of the frontier, drove the Federals into their principal redan, cut off their water supply by gaining and occupying the river shore, and finally adopted the novel and effective expedient of using movable breastworks by gradually rolling forward bales of wet hemp. On September 20, after 52 hours of gallant defense, Mulligan's position became untenable. The reinforcements he had a right to expect did not come. His water cisterns were exhausted. The stench from dead animals burdened the air about his fort. Someone at length, without authority, displayed a white flag, and Price sent a note which asked, "Colonel, what has caused the cessation of the fight?" Mulligan's Irish wit was equal to the occasion, and he wrote on the back of the note, "General, I hardly know, unless you have surrendered." The pleasantry led to a formal parley, and Mulligan, with the advice of his officers, surrendered. The uncertainty which for several days hung over the fate of Lexington and the dramatic incidents of the fight excited the liveliest interest throughout the West. Newspaper discussion soon made it evident that this new Union loss might have been avoided by reasonable prudence and energy on the part of Fremont, as there were plenty of disposable troops at various points, which during the slow approach and long-deferred attack of Price could have been hurried to Mulligan's support. There were universal outcry and demand that at least the disaster should be retrieved by a prompt movement to intercept and capture Price on his retreat. Fremont himself seems to have felt the sting of the disgrace, for, reporting the surrender, he added, "I am taking the field myself and hope to destroy the enemy either before or after the junction of forces under McCulloch. Please notify the President immediately." "Your dispatch of this day is received," responded General Scott. "The President is glad you are hastening to the scene of action. His words are, he expects you to repair the disaster at Lexington without loss of time." This hope was not destined to reach a fulfillment. Price almost immediately retreated southward from Lexington with his captured booty, among which the Great Seal of the State figures as a conspicuous item in his report. On September 24, Fremont published his order, organizing his army of 5 divisions under Brigadier General John Pope at Boonville, Major J. McKinstry at Syracuse, Major General David Hunter at Versailles, Brigadier General Franz Sigel at Georgetown, Brigadier General Alexander Ashboth at Tipton. On paper, it formed a respectable show of force, figuring as an aggregate of nearly 39,000. In reality, it was at the moment well nigh powerless, being scattered and totally unprepared for the field. Fremont's chronic inattention to details and his entire lack of methodical administration now fully reveal themselves. Even under the imperative orders of the general, nearly a month elapsed before the various divisions could be concentrated at Springfield, and they were generally in miserable plight as to transportation, supplies, and ammunition. Amidst a succession of sanguine newspaper reports setting forth the incidents and great expectations of Fremont's campaign, The convincing evidence could not be disguised that the whole movement would finally prove worthless and barren. Meanwhile, acting on his growing solicitude, President Lincoln directed special inquiry, and about the 13th of October, the Secretary of War, accompanied by the Adjutant General of the Army, reached Fremont's camp at Tipton. His immediate report to the President confirmed his apprehension. Secretary Cameron wrote: I returned to this place last night from the headquarters of General Fremont at Tipton. I found there and in the immediate neighborhood some 40,000 troops, with one brigade, General McKinstry's, in good condition for the field and well provided. Others not exhibiting good care and but poorly supplied with munitions, arms, and clothing. I had an interview with General Fremont, and in conversation with him showed him an order for his removal. He was very much mortified, pained, and I thought humiliated. He made an earnest appeal to me, saying that he had come to Missouri at the request of the government to assume a very responsible command, and that when he reached this state he found himself without troops and without any preparation for an army, that he had exerted himself, as he believed, with great energy, and had now around him a fine army with everything to make success certain, that he was in pursuit of the enemy, who he believed were within his reach, and that to recall him at this moment would not only destroy him, but render his whole expenditure useless. In reply to this appeal, I told him that I would withhold the order until my return to Washington, giving him the interim to prove the reality of his hopes as to reaching and capturing the enemy, giving him to understand that, should he fail, he must give place to some other officer. He assured me that, should he fail, he would resign at once. It is proper that I should state that after this conversation I met General Hunter, who in very distinct terms told me that his division of the army, although then under orders to march, and a part of his command actually on the road, could not be put in proper condition for marching for a number of days. To a question I put to him whether he believed General Fremont fit for the command, he replied that he did not think that he was, and informed me that though second in command, he knew nothing whatever of the purposes or plans of his chief. The opinion of another division commander, General Pope, was freely expressed in a letter which Hunter exhibited to the Secretary. I received at 1 o'clock last night the extraordinary order of General Fremont for a forward movement of his whole force. The wonderful manner in which the actual facts and conditions of things here are ignored stupefies me. One would suppose from this order that divisions and brigades are organized and are under immediate command of their officers, that transportation is in possession of all, that every arrangement of supply trains to follow the army has been made, in fact, that we are in a perfect state of preparation for a move. You know as well as I do that the exact reverse is the fact, that neither brigades nor divisions have been brought together, and that if they were, there is not transportation enough to move this army 100 yards, that in truth not one solitary preparation of any kind has been made to enable this advance movement to be executed. I have never seen my division, nor do I suppose you have seen yours. I have no cavalry, even for a personal escort. And yet this order requires me to send forward companies of pioneers protected by cavalry. Is it intended that this order be obeyed, or rather that we try to obey it? Or is the order only designed for Washington and the papers? I went to Jefferson City the last time I saw you for the express purpose of getting transportation for my division, and explained to General Fremont precisely what I have said above. How, in the face of the fact that he knew no transportation was furnished, and that Kelton has none, he should coolly order such a movement and expect it to be made, I cannot understand on any reasonable or common sense hypothesis. Another letter to the President from a more cautious and conservative officer, Brigadier General Samuel R. Curtis, exercising a local command in St. Louis, gave an equally discouraging view of the situation. Your Excellency's letter of the 7th inst., desiring me to express my views in regard to General Fremont frankly and confidentially to the Secretary of War, was presented by him yesterday. and I have complied with your Excellency's request. Matters have gone from bad to worse, and I am greatly obliged by your Excellency's letter, which breaks the restraint of military law and enables me to relieve myself of a painful silence. In my judgment, General Fremont lacks the intelligence, the experience, and the sagacity necessary to his command. I have reluctantly and gradually been forced to this conclusion. His reserve evinces vanity or embarrassment, which I never could so far overcome as to fully penetrate his capacity. He would talk of plans which, being explained, only related to some move of a general or some dash at a shadow, and I am now convinced he has no general plan. Forces are scattered and generally isolated without being in supporting distance or relation to each other, and when I have expressed apprehension as to some, I have seen no particular exertion to repel or relieve till it was too late. I know the demand made on him for force everywhere is oppressive, but remote posts have improperly stood out, and some still stand inviting assault without power to retreat, fortify, or reinforce. Our forces should be concentrated with the rivers as a base of operation, and these rivers and railroads afford means for sudden and salutary assaults on the enemy. The question you propound ought General Fremont to be relieved from or retained in his present command seems easily answered. It is only a question of manner and time. Public opinion is an element of war which must not be neglected. Thus the opinions of 3 trained and experienced army officers who had every means of judging from actual personal observation coincided with the general drift of evidence which had come to the President from civilian officials and citizens. Fremont had frittered away his opportunity for usefulness and fame, such an opportunity indeed as rarely comes. He had taken his command 3 months before with the universal goodwill of almost every individual, every subordinate, every official, every community in his immense department. In his brief incumbency, he not only lost the general public confidence, but incurred the special displeasure or direct enmity of those most prominent in influence or command next to him, and without whose friendship and cooperation success was practically impossible. Waiting and hoping till the last moment, President Lincoln at length felt himself forced to intervene. On the 24th of October, just 3 months after Fremont had assumed command, he directed an order to be made that Fremont should be relieved and General Hunter be called temporarily to take his command. This order he dispatched by the hand of a personal friend to General Curtis at St. Louis with the following letter. Dear Sir, on receipt of this, with the accompanying enclosures, you will take safe, certain, and suitable measures to have the enclosure addressed to Major General Fremont, delivered to him with all reasonable dispatch, subject to these conditions only, that if, when General Fremont shall be reached by the messenger, yourself or anyone sent by you, he shall then have, in personal command, fought and won a battle, or shall then be actually in a battle, or shall then be in the immediate presence of the enemy in expectation of a battle, it is not to be delivered, but held for further orders. After, and not till after, the delivery to General Fremont, let the enclosure addressed to General Hunter be delivered to him. It will be seen that the conditions attending the delivery of this order were somewhat peculiar. If General Fremont had just won a battle, or were on the eve of fighting one, then both justice to him and more especially the risk or gain to the Union cause rendered it inexpedient to make a sudden change in command. But the question also had another and possibly serious aspect. Amid all his loss of prestige and public confidence, Fremont had retained the clamorous adhesion and noisy demonstrative support of 3 distinct elements. First, a large number of officers to whom he had given irregular commissions issued by himself, subject to the approval of the President. These commissions for the moment gave their holders rank, pay, and power, and to some of them he had assigned extraordinary duties and trusts under special instructions, regardless of proper military usage and method. The second class was the large and respectable German population of St. Louis and other portions of Missouri, forming the nucleus of the radical faction whose cause he had especially espoused. The third class comprised the men of strong anti-slavery convictions throughout the Union, who hailed his act of military emancipation with unbounded approval. The first class composed about his person a clique of active partisans, wielding power and dispensing patronage in his name. The other two supplied a convenient public echo. Out of such surroundings and conditions there began to come a cry of persecution and a vague hum of insubordination coupled with adulations of the general. Some of his favorites talked imprudently of defiance and resistance to authority. Occasional acts of Fremont himself gave a color of plausibility to these mutterings. He had neglected to discontinue the expensive fortifications and barracks when directed to do so by the Secretary of War. Even since the President ordered him to modify his proclamation, he had on one occasion personally directed the original document to be printed and distributed. Several of his special appointees were stationed about the city of St. Louis, so they should control every fort, arsenal, and communication without regard to commanding officers or quartermasters. Suspicions naturally arose and were publicly expressed that he would not freely yield up his command, or if he did not actually resist superior authority, that he might at least, upon some pretext, temporarily prolong his power. There was, of course, no danger that he could successfully defy the orders of the President. The bulk of his army, officers, and soldiers would have spurned such a proposition, but the example of delay or doubt, any shadow of insubordination, would have had an extremely pernicious effect upon public opinion. General Curtis therefore sent a trusted bearer of dispatches who, by an easy stratagem, entered Fremont's camp, gained a personal audience, and delivered the official order of removal. Duplicates of the President's letters were at the same time and with equal care dispatched to the camp of General Hunter at a considerable distance, and he traveled all night to assume his new duties. When he reached Fremont's camp on the following day, he learned that ostensible preparations had been made and orders issued for a battle, on the assumption that the enemy was at Wilson's Creek advancing to an attack. Taking command, Hunter sent a reconnaissance to Wilson's Creek and obtained reliable evidence that no enemy whatever was there or expected there. Fremont had been duped by his own scouts, for it is hardly possible to conceive that he deliberately arranged this final bit of theatrical effect. The actual fact was that while Price, retreating southward by slow and easy marches, kept well beyond any successful pursuit, his army of 20,000, which had captured Lexington, dwindled away as rapidly as it had grown. His movement partook more of the nature of a frontier foray than an organized campaign. The squirrel hunters of western Missouri, whose accurate sharpshooting drove Mulligan into his entrenchments to starvation or surrender, returned to their farms or their forest haunts to await the occasion of some new and exciting expedition. The whole present effort of General Price, now at the head of only 10,000 or 12,000 men, was only to reach an easy junction with McCulloch on the Arkansas border, so that their united force might make a successful stand, or at least ensure a safe retreat from the Union army. President Lincoln, however, did not intend that the campaign to the Southwest should be continued. Other plans were being matured. With the order to supersede Fremont, he also sent the following letters explaining his well-considered views and conveying his express directions. Washington, October 24, 1861. Brigadier General S.R. Curtis, my dear sir, herewith is a document, half letter, half order, which wishing you to see, but not to make public, I send unsealed. Please read it and then enclose it to the officer who may be in command of the Department of the West at the time it reaches him. I cannot now know whether Fremont or Hunter will then be in command. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. Washington, October 24, 1861, to the Commander of the Department of the West. Sir: The command of the Department of the West having devolved upon you, I propose to offer you a few suggestions. Knowing how hazardous it is to bind down a distant commander in the field to specific lines and operations, as so much always depends on a knowledge of localities and passing events, it is intended, therefore, to leave a considerable margin for the exercise of your judgment and discretion. The main rebel army, Price's, west of the Mississippi, is believed to have passed Dade County in full retreat upon northwestern Arkansas, leaving Missouri almost freed from the enemy, excepting in the southeast of the state. Assuming this basis of fact, it seems desirable, as you are not likely to overtake Price and are in danger of making too long a line from your own base of supplies and reinforcements, that you should give up the pursuit, halt your main army, divide it into two corps of observation, one occupying Sedalia and the other Rolla, the present termini of railroads, then recruit the condition of both corps by reestablishing and improving their discipline and instructions, perfecting their clothing and equipments, and providing less uncomfortable quarters. Of course, both railroads must be guarded and kept open, judiciously employing just so much force as is necessary for this. From these 2 points, Sedalia and Rolla, and especially in judicious cooperation with Lane on the Kansas border, it would be so easy to concentrate and repel any army of the enemy returning on Missouri from the southwest that it is not probable any such attempt to return will be made before or during the approaching cold weather. Before spring, the people of Missouri will probably be in no favorable mood to renew for next year the troubles which have so much afflicted and impoverished them during this. If you adopt this line of policy, and if, as I anticipate, you will see no enemy in great force approaching, you will have a surplus of force which you can withdraw from these points and direct to others as may be needed, the railroads furnishing ready means of reinforcing those main points if occasion requires. Doubtless local uprisings will for a time continue to occur, but these can be met by detachments and local forces of our own, and will ere long tire out of themselves. While, as stated in the beginning of the letter, a large discretion must be and is left with yourself, I feel sure that an indefinite pursuit of Price or an attempt by this long and circuitous route to reach Memphis will be exhaustive beyond endurance and will end in the loss of the whole force engaged in it. Your obedient servant, A. Lincoln. The change of command occasioned neither trouble nor danger. Fremont himself acted with perfect propriety. He took leave of his army in a brief and temperate address and returned to St. Louis, where he was welcomed by his admirers with a public meeting and eulogistic speeches. The demonstration was harmless and unimportant, though care had been taken to send authority to General Curtis to repress disorder, and specially to look to the safety of the city and the arsenal. In accordance with the policy outlined by the President, General Hunter soon drew back the Federal army from Springfield to Rolla, and the greater part of it was transferred to another field of operations. Hearing of this retrograde movement, McCulloch rapidly advanced and for a season occupied Springfield. One of the distressing effects of these successive movements of contending forces is described in a sentence of his report. The Union men have nearly all fled with the Federal troops, leaving this place almost deserted. End of chapter 24.